One of the big challenges I see in businesses is they got a little bit of a vision in their head, but everyone's sort of siloed. There's not sort of a strategic alignment with the different groups of people in the organization. So, what's the first thing of getting your vision right and then getting strategic alignment with the rest of the company?
Well, that's two pieces. One is to understand what it is the CEO or the owner has in their head as far as a vision is concerned. So, yeah, which will be long term. So that might be 10 years out, it might be 15 years out, but what is that vision? So it's talking to them and understanding that. The second part is obviously they are struggling to communicate that with the team. That's why we end up with siloed teams. Yeah, it's really interesting. You ask someone in the company, what is the vision of the company, and they don't know. So there's no communication or clear communication to the team. So it's really understanding what the vision is, and then you've got to break it down and work through. There are certain elements to pull that vision together, and it's working through getting those elements clear, really simple, not sentences of writing for each one. It's got to be quite crisp and to the point. And then in conjunction with doing that, it's really has to be done with the leadership team of the company. They've got to be involved. They've got to be part of setting those elements. Two reasons. One, they have the knowledge of the market and of their customers, so it's vital they're involved. But secondly, by doing that and with that being set as a team, you're all committing to it and the way forward. So from that, you get alignment at the leadership team level, but then it's taking that and really making sure that when it's communicated back to other people within the company, that it's simple and clear. So, this, as a friend of mine says, if your grandmother can't understand your strategy, how do you expect your team to? So, yeah, yeah. So it is simplifying it down, but you've got to get the elements clear to enable that to happen.
I can easily see it, Chinese whispers. And I mean, a huge part, I think, for leadership is ownership. Like if someone's part of the creation of the idea and understand why it exists, and then it's delegated the responsibility to deliver on it, they're a lot more motivated because it's their idea. It's a lot different. Like you come into a room, I used to do that with like sales team. If I'm new, I'll come in, I'll be like, all right, guys, what are your expectations of me? We start writing on the board. What do you want from me? And then the other thing is, okay, if I deliver on those, what can I expect from you? And then they boom, boom, boom. And then because they created it, as long as I deliver on the first part and they're, somewhat of a reasonable human, they're probably going to do it. So I just see, was there an example of one vision that wasn't quite clear with one of your past clients or a business owner, and then how sort of the process they work through to make it simple?
Um, Quite often they know where to go or where they want to go. The challenge that I usually see coming through with that is they're unsure. So that's where we've really got to start pulling the strategy together and look at certain elements. So, and it's very much, are the core values clear in the company? It's also, what is the purpose of the company? What are you most passionate about as a company? Those pieces have to be figured out. And that just starts bringing some clear purpose to it. But your purpose within a company is why you're here and what difference are you making in the world today? It's getting really clear on that. That's actually driving where you're going forward, obviously, around what difference are you making in the world. But that's very long term. They talk about your purpose being the star in the night sky. It's light years away, and that's fine. But let's get it clear. Why are we here? As an organization or a company, why are we here? And so that needs to be got clear. It's usually there, especially with the business owner. It's like quite often they started the business for more than just providing an income. So it's talking to them around that, and that starts to become clearer. Then it's also working through other elements, understanding what the company really can be best in the world at, in their world, right? So, not the whole world, but in their world and business. But yeah, what can they be best in the world at? And that's very much aligned with your customers. So it's, what do your customers value? What do they value highly? So there's a whole piece around that that has to be worked out, worked through around the customers, and what's truly driving the economic engine of the company. Now, many companies will say, oh, profit. It's like, actually, that's a result. Yeah. So why is it your customers come back? Why is it your customers refer you? Yeah, it's starting to understand that piece. So it's very customer centric, and it has to be. Yeah, and without going into a lot of depth, there are other parts of strategy that are also have to become clear. Yeah, but when it becomes clear, it enables the company to. There's an old saying: companies say no more than they say yes, and the reason that comes around is they actually are clear where they're going. So yeah, going back to your salesperson, right? If a salesperson, they love shiny stuff, right? But they could, quite often will be bringing ideas. But if your strategy is clear, it's very easily you're able to sit down, look at it, and say, is this aligned or is it not? And you can quickly come to a decision because you can run through your strategic elements and go, does it align with this? Yes or no? Does it align with this? Yes or no? And if you start getting lots of no's, just forget it. Get it off the table. So, yeah, it really does help speed up your decision making within a company and keep everyone aligned. And they can understand, what are we going to do and what are we not going to do and where are we going? And that's a big frustration for a lot of people and a lot of companies. I quite often talk to people, and it's really interesting, not the CEOs, but just people in other parts of companies. It's like they don't know where the company's going. And that becomes a big challenge for employers because it doesn't show them if there's potential to grow more, learn more, progression. So where's that sitting for the employee? So it has quite deep effects right through your people.
Yeah, it makes. I mean, I just sort of think like there's sort of two schools of thought I come across with leadership. Is one, there's the micromanage. You gotta, have really clear instructions. It's, standard operating procedure, and it's all broken down so they know exactly how to do. Well, there's the other one where you have clearly defined ways to look at things, like values and vision. It's like it's really hard to tell your people in every possible scenario what they should do. But if your values are empathy or responsibility or authenticity, and they're presented with a situation that isn't in the standard operating procedure, so how do they behave? Well, they look to the values. Is it aligned with the values that we stand as a company, and is it aligned with where we're going? If it's not, so what do you think about like? So you got the vision, and now the leadership's coming in, and now you're going to tell all the rest of them, oh, we're going to do this now. Or maybe you're the guy that keeps coming up with new ideas, and they're like, oh, here's another new idea. It's not going to go anywhere again. Like, how do you invigorate the joy of the others?
I it goes back to you. It does go back to your people. I always talk about people first. You've got to get that piece right within the company. However, to do that, you've got to make sure that your purpose is clear and that your core values are clear. And what are the behaviors that are expected around those core values as well? Because if people don't have the same values, then they shouldn't be in the organization, and they won't stick around for long anyway because it's not them. There's no right or wrong with that. It's just where do we fit? And so you've got to get the right fit with the people on the team. And the second part to that is you've got to be really clear around systems and processes because, yes, we need them. Ultimately, they're to enable the people to deliver standard. And that's the piece that a lot of people forget. It's like they're actually there to enable the people, right? So, we need them, but at the same time, it's being clear on what is the standard we need to deliver. And then from that, with those things clear, the leadership team can then start to cascade things. Yeah, it's like you shouldn't be micromanaging. Yeah, most people hate being micromanaged. Yeah, and they don't need to be micromanaged if the right things are in place. Yeah, so you've got to cascade down accountability. You've got to cascade down responsibility, and you've got to trust your people that they will stick. Yeah, they'll deliver, but at the same time, they will stick and be true to the core values. So yeah, micromanaging is not a good thing.
It's one of the most liberating things. I mean, like you think about staff fundamentally as an opportunity to buy you time. And if you're trying to control or influence the process, then you're hiring them incorrectly. You know, you're hiring them to be micromanaged to cause more bottleneck on you, more stress and frustration. And you can always see it in the one man bands. It's like an inability to collaborate or believe they can do it to the standard of which they can do it. The reality is you can't. You might be exceptional. You might be a technical, you know, operator that's so amazing, and you it might be pretty good, but you also got 90 different responsibilities, so you can't put enough time in, you can't put enough reps in, and if you have one person doing the same thing consistently over and over, they're going to outpace you. But I'll be curious on accountability. That's always a challenge. How do you manage between accountability and not being mean or being nice or not being too nice? Like, what actually is good accountability?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think the first thing we've got to explain, accountability is not responsibility. You're right. So when you're accountable for something, that's where the buck stops, right? Responsibility is doing when you're actually doing something and you're responsible to get it done. So they're quite different. And that's what I'd see regularly missing in a lot of companies is they've got plenty of responsibility, but very little accountability, right? So that accountability piece has to be worked out around roles and also around processes. Now, when you're moving into being a mid-market company and you want to grow, whoever it is at that point leading the company, they have got to move away from being a technician. So that's the time they've got to put the right people around them at at the leadership table, and it may be over a few years, but they've got to build that team, and because they have to be released from being a technician. So that's where we look at the accountability around processes usually is not there, right? And that has to be got clear quickly. Right. So who's accountable for which processes? What are the outcomes those processes have to deliver? Right. Now, being accountable for a process doesn't mean you're doing it. Right. If you're just accountable. You're the person if it's not going well, like something's broken in the process, or it's not quite working right, but you're the person they go to for that process. Right. So that people need to know where to go to get things fixed. Or if there's challenges within that process. So that piece has to be got clear. Now, the key here is a leader of a company, as it's moving into mid-market or once they hit emerging mid-market. So to put some what does that mean? When a company's around 7-8 million, this becomes critical in revenue. So that's when you've got to really address it, because you get to 7-8 million, the CEO, general manager, whatever their title, they have to be working on the projects that are driving the company forward. If they're stuck with accountabilities and process, they'll be pulled into operations all the time, right? And they won't be working on the projects that are really going to deliver the outcomes they're looking for the company. It could be revenue growth, profit, etc. They won't have time. So they've got to be released. But it comes back to start building the leadership team around you. So you want really capable people and get the accountability clear, and then you can cascade responsibility and parts of that accountability at times as well.
It's an interesting spot. I've only heard it through others, but like the two hardest spots I've heard in business is one, you're first starting and now you're just getting kicked in the teeth every second day. And then the other one is you're in that gap between where you can afford to hire the leadership team that can liberate you from certain areas, but you're the constraint in the business, but you don't quite have enough money to hire them, Like, can you sort of speak to that transition piece, or sort of how is that resolved, and what stage is there the big problem in that sort of mid-market piece?
Yeah, and you're very right. The big thing is they can't afford that resource. But where we see they can is somewhere between 4 million in revenue or turnover and 6 million. Right? That's where we see when they start hitting those numbers and, and revenue, then that's where they can start to afford it. So what they've got to look at is they've got to look forward here too, right? Is you've got to look at it and say, right, which role is going to make the biggest difference to the company and to myself as the leader first? And you start to figure that out, right? The trick here is don't hire for the now, right? You've got to hire for the future. And what I'm saying here is you've got to look at it and say, yes, we're going to grow. This is where we're going to be in 3 years. So if you hire a person, let's say it's an operations manager is the first thing you need, right? Well, that's fine. But that operations manager must be capable of actually doing that role at the turnover you expect to be at in 3 years' time. Now, if we get that wrong, then we've created a bottleneck, because what happens is the company outgrows the capability of that leader, and then you've got a real problem, right? So quite often in growth companies, you can't grow people in all cases as fast as the company's growing. So you've always got to be hiring ahead. And yes, it costs a bit more money, but it's well worth it.
Yeah, it's interesting that it's like I've only recently partnered with a software company that's further along than I was. I just started a company to learn marketing, and I figured why not get paid while I learn and just tell my clients I don't know what I'm doing, but take a punt. And like, all right, sort of that didn't work that well for me. But it's an interesting point. Like I knew people were important. Like I've managed teams of 12, but I didn't know how well they are at seeing around corners, like how good they are at finding things you never even considered. Like anytime I liberate myself from a process and give them ownership over it, it's it's hard to even comprehend how far a human can move you forward when you let them. But I was just curious, like, is there a barrier that often businesses face with that? Hey, I'm going to pay this person, 10% more than the market, but I know that they're going to be 5 times more productive, because it's really, if you pay, it's quite disproportionate the value you get from a human. But how do you overcome that barrier of like, oh, I got to hire this person, they're expensive, and how do I know it's going to be worth it?
It comes back to being clear, what do you expect from that role? Right. So it really does come back down to being very clear on the role description, not so much in responsibility, but you've really got to think about what are the outcomes you're looking for from this role. If someone fills this role, what are the outcomes I need here? What are the outcomes the company needs? It's getting that clear and then building the job description out from there. So yeah, plenty of HR companies that can do that. They do it all every day. But as a business owner, you've got to get really clear on those outcomes, because they can be quite unique to you and may be quite different to others in your own industry. So yeah, it's getting clear on the outcomes. Then it becomes, if those outcomes are going to be delivered, then do you mind paying that money? Yeah, that's the way you look at it.
It's insane. Yeah, it's disproportionate, because I know there's a company called Attention Seekers, and they're really good at brand. But I always see them hiring more than what's required for what they do. They have a good value, like revenue per employee. But I was just like, geez, you just keep getting all these people and it's to help you grow. But I'm like, isn't growth just like selling more? I couldn't quite associate growth with bringing people in. But I just see curious. So we've got the strategic vision. We're bringing it down to the people, and we're going to disseminate it across. Like, so how do you go about communicating it to them? And once you've communicated to them, what does it actually look like in delivering the vision?
Um, it's well, it comes back to that people piece and being clear on what roles they've got to deliver. yeah, the key is if everyone knows the strategy and you're able to actually very simply talk to each component of it, right, from a company strategy perspective. And one thing I'll say here is a sales strategy is not company strategy. A marketing strategy is not, company strategy. Those are, that's a sales strategy, that's a marketing strategy, but they're to enable the company strategy, which is sort of an umbrella above it, if you like. Right? It's to enable that to be achieved. So I just want to make that distinction. So yeah, you leave those out when you're talking to company strategy. Excuse me. So it's being really clear, what is our purpose? What are our core values? Where do we want to be in 10 years? Where do we want to be in 3 years' time? What are the key thrusts and capabilities that we have to achieve? Thrusts is all around growth, new products, new markets, new geographies. Capabilities can be around software, machinery, people. They're all the assets in the company, if you like. But be very clear on what you've got to achieve where you need to be in 3 years' time. And when you're looking at 3 years' time, it is. Where are you going to be at? What's the revenue going to be at that point? What's the profit going to be at that point? What's the cash situation going to be at that point? What products and services are we going to be selling into which markets at that point? That could be around New Zealand, could be internationally, but you've got to get really clear on those, right? And then, along with aligning everything with the customers, but then you've got to come back and how do you communicate that really simply, right? And it's until it's there, and you work through it with a company, it's hard to give examples because the other problem is then I could give away strategic information. But companies that are growing are very clear on that, and they can communicate it well and simply.
Let's use an example of like how that would actually look. So the vision is this, purpose is this, core values, and if they're not good, that's fine. Like, this is sort of making an idea, but just to help conceptualize what that actually looks like in a real example or a pretend example.
If you look at the purpose for a company, you've really got to relate it back to what they do, and because it will be totally related, right? So, I've just got to be careful with what I say there, but
describe the only company in New Zealand.
Well, there's a number I could describe, but I think some people would pick up who I'm talking about pretty quickly. But it's not hard to work through. But I think the key here is you've got to look at, what is it that gets you out of bed in the morning? What are you most passionate about? What is the difference you're making in the world or want to make in the world? That brings you to the why. So, so that has to be clear. Your core values got to be clear. It's not just are we delivering to the core values in effect, how we operate in the market, is it aligned to our core values? But it says people, are we aligned to the core values? So are our behaviors totally aligned to the core values? Those things are really important as well. With that clear, and then looking at the other elements, companies get to a point where, and look, it's not setting company strategies, not an event, because it's never 100% clear. You could spend 2 days on it and there will be questions. And so you've got to get those questions answered. So it takes most companies between, 3 and 9 months to get that totally clear. It doesn't stop them growing, and they're getting clearer and clearer as they work through it, right? But it does take a little bit of time. They should then be able to communicate that back to the team in one phrase. That's the point you've got to get to, right? And then everyone can see where you're going. You can talk to the other elements, obviously, and they're visible within the organisation. So that gives people a deeper understanding behind it, and a lot more why. So with that clear, then you can communicate it. So with companies, it's really interesting. I will share with you without naming the company, obviously, but they came to me 10 years ago Two shareholders, they had a vision for the future, and one of those shareholders stepped in as the CEO. But what's interesting is they've got that clear way back then. They also did what a lot of companies wouldn't do. They were in a position which is probably a little bit better than a lot of other companies. They had sold a couple of companies before, so they had some cash behind them, but they actually hired ahead of the curve, right? So they were hiring senior roles before the revenue could justify it. But what it did was it drove growth. And they were very clear after getting the strategy clear, they were very clear on where they wanted to be in 10 years. Right. So then working back from that, it was work at the time, it was, you work back from 10 years to 3 years. Right. So where do we need to be in 3? But I got a phone call last Friday afternoon from the CEO. They're 1 month off that 10 years. And he was very excited, couldn't quite believe it, but they had achieved their 10-year goals. So, but they'd stuck to the strategy the whole way through. So, yeah, very happy. Got to, need a new 10-year goal or new 10-year BHAG now. But but the difference is that company has grown by 50 times in revenue in that 10 years.
Yeah, impressive. I heard of Big Hero Audacious Goal, BHAG. Is that Mastering Rockefeller Habits? I think that's a book I vaguely remember reading.
Yes, it actually comes from Jim Collins. And actually, I don't think he coined it either. I actually think it comes out of the technology world from Microsoft or somewhere actually before that. But yeah, big, hairy, audacious goal. So it's very much setting that where for a company, you've got to set your purpose first, and then you've got to set your BHAG. So two things about the BHAG. It's the first Mount Everest you're going to climb on the way to achieving the purpose. The second piece is that a lot of people, because there's people that are quite negative about BHAGs out there, and I can see why. Because some people have just set them way too high. So when you look at a BHAG, you should be asking in the back of your mind, is this 70% achievable? And that keeps it in reality. You're not being way, way too optimistic.
Yeah, it's a balance. It's surprising. Like I think a good example is SpaceX. It's like, or even NASA back in the day. I think JFK walked in. There's some famous story. Walked into the NASA building and asked the janitor, "Oh, what are you doing?" And he's like, "I'm helping people get to the moon." And it's interesting when you are brave enough to put it out there, how everything can become aligned, and you can actually be surprised that you can achieve it. But just on that, how do you determine you're not being over optimistic or too pessimistic? How do you know that your goal's within reason?
Yeah, that's a good question. Where I take people back to is you've got to look at your cash situation, right? And how much cash have you got from when you're setting out on the journey. The second thing you've got to think about is we need to generate cash on the way, right? Otherwise, cash is oxygen. Without it, we die, right? As a company. So that has to be thought about in the background. But that doesn't mean that if you're right with strategy, you should be looking at not industry benchmarks from a profitability perspective. And when I'm talking to that, I'm talking about operating profit and I'm talking about EBITDA. So you've got to look at those areas. What a lot of companies don't realize, and there's a lot of research out there that backs this up, or studies, etc., that can be accessed. It's not those fast-growing companies, apart from there are some unicorns, but but generally, it's not fast-growing companies that end up doing really, really well. It's the companies that manage compound growth. Right? So, it's like you can grow really fast, but once you pass 5-6 million in revenue, you you really got to look hard at that. It's like, are you can keep going with speed, but you'll need outside investment, right? You may need funding rounds. So, some owners don't want to do that. Some do want to do that, right? Which is fine. But you've got to look at which way you're going from that perspective. You know, and then if you're not going to get external funding and etc., of course you'll always borrow money. But I'm talking about bringing other people in as shareholders and putting money into the company. If you're not going down that track, then what you've got to really look at is say, well, hang on, what is the compound growth rate we want to grow at? So to put that in perspective, what a lot of people don't realize is that if you grow at 15% per annum over and above inflation, right, you double in size every 5 years. Yeah, that's not bad. And it's only 15% a year. But as you get bigger, that 15% becomes a lot larger in how many millions of dollars it is. Right? But the key there is, can you grow compounding? When you move the needle on the percentage, it becomes quite scary. So if you decide you want to grow at 25% per annum, which some clients have year after year after year, and they've been able to fund the majority of that because their profitability has been way above benchmark, which comes back to having the strategy clear to achieve that. But at 25% per annum, you quadruple in size every 6 years. You'll be 4 times bigger in 6. So that 15 to 25%, it's a big shift because you're doing 25% per annum. What's generally the biggest headache? What's going to be your biggest challenge? People. Yeah. You're going to need a lot more people, right? And you've got to fund it. But then the second part is watching your cash. That's the second thing you've got to watch at 25% per annum. So, if you're at 10 million and growing at 25%, that means next year you're adding 2.5 million more in revenue. So, how do we deliver that?
I mean, I look at it from a market standpoint in terms of compounding. So when you start seeing your ads underperform, for example, you're spending more, the creative's good, but they just suddenly stop performing. It's because you're compounding negative word of mouth. And I think that's something that's not really looked at in business enough. It's like, okay, you're growing fast, but you're creating a subpar experience that's compounding negative word of mouth. And I think the fastest way to get rich is to get rich slow. Because if you actually understand the framework of why you're doing certain things, and there's a strong base, but then there's also the limitation of using as an excuse not to push yourself. How do you balance that between compounding growth and limiting beliefs? I want to grow, but let's keep it comfortable. What's that sort of plateau?
Yeah, if you want to grow, then you're going to have to push yourself out of your comfort zone, right? All the time. It's just part of it, right? But it's understanding, what do we need to learn, right? That's the key, and we can't learn everything. So that goes back to your people, and say, well, what people do I need, within the organisation or within the company to really enable the growth? But if your strategy is clear, your metrics are the right metrics within the company, and this is where, when I mentioned delivery before with growth, you've got to make sure you're delivering really, really well, regardless of what you do, right? Because otherwise, it will be negative. And you'll probably have a crisis internally as well within the company. Yeah. So, because if you're not delivering well, there's other things that aren't going well within the company. And so, just being able to balance it. But as a leader, we've got to keep growing. But a big part of it's, with that growth, it's understanding where have we got to let go.
It's huge that, I mean, the most common reason I see a salesperson stop performing is because they realized the product wasn't what they thought. They no longer had conviction. And when all you see is negative experiences from trying to grow too fast, you can see how it get that way. But anyways, you've done a whole podcast, mate. So thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it.